Hi, and welcome to this Android video series presentation on services. We're going to talk about three types of services. Normal services and bound services are essentially the same thing. They are derived from the same class, service, and then we'll also talk about intent services and how they work as well. So what is a service, essentially? A service is a component of an application that performs a specific task, or it can share methods of itself with the rest of the application. A service is essentially like an activity, but there is no user interface. It is started using an intent, and they have their own life cycle. So services have methods like onCreate and onDestroy, just like activities do. But they also have some specific other methods that we'll talk about here in just a moment. By default, however, an Android service runs on the main UI thread. So a service or a bound service runs on the main UI thread. Now, an intent service actually runs on a separate thread, but if you're going to use a service or a bound service, not an intent service, and you need to run on a separate thread, then you need to set that up yourself. Long-running services should start a separate thread and run in them, or you can have things like UI blocking, which is bad, or ANRs, which are application not responding errors, which kill your running app, which is very bad. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that a service starts a thread. By default, it does not. Service lifecycle, like I talked about here, has an onCreate and an onStart method. OnCreate is run when the service is first started using start service. OnStart is run immediately after onCreate, and at that point the service is running. When the service is stopped, onDestroy is called. There is also a method called onBind, and I apologize, that should be a lowercase o in onBind. But onBind is a special method if we're going to bind to the service from some other application component. However, in a service or a bound service, we must override onBind. The difference is, in a bound service, we return the binder, but in a regular service, we return null. There is a manifest entry for services, as you might expect, and the minimal entry is the service entity, service tag, with the Android name attribute set to the name of the class with a dot in front of it, or a period. This is the same as setting up a activity manifest entry, as you might recall. But we use the service tag instead of the activity tag. We can also use Android process to specify a process in which the service should run. If the Android process attribute name begins with a colon, then the process is within our application. It's private to the application that we're in. But we can also start it with just a lowercase letter. If that's the case, we're specifying a process that can be global. It might be in another app. And this tells the application that we specify, or the process that we specify, that this service is runnable. If the other application has the proper permissions and intents, it'll be runnable. So that's a service. Now let's talk about an intent service. A subclass of service that runs in its own thread. Okay. Well, the service class has a subclass called intent service. And an intent service, unlike a bound service or just a regular service, does run in a separate thread than the main UI thread. And so we can set up an intent service, and they're very easy to set up. This intent service is going to process intents. It's going to handle intents until it runs out of intents to process, after which time it will destroy itself. So an intent service is kind of like a self-running service. It runs on a separate thread. When it's done processing intents, it's done, and it destroys itself. What else could you want? It's beautiful. We don't have to explicitly stop an intent service. Now, with a service or a bound service, we must stop it. Otherwise, that pointer that bound the service or started the service is just going to keep on running, and that's a leak. That's a memory leak. So how does an intent service grab these intents? Well, there's a method, a lifecycle method of an intent service that gets each intent for each request, and it is called on-handle intent. When it runs out of intents, the service is destroyed and on-destroy is called. The third type of service is a bound service. Now, we subclass the same class to get a service or a bound service. And remember that on-bind method? In a service, we return null. Well, in a bound service, we return something called an I-binder. And this is usually just a wrapper that extends the binder class that calls get service on itself and returns this bound service. Once you have a binder, you can have methods in the bound service that aren't connected to anything but themselves, and then client processes can call those methods as long as they're public. From the client, we call the bind service method. In the service, we use the on-bind lifecycle method. So the client process must declare a service connection that calls on service connected and on service disconnected to check and see if that bound service is bound. And if it's bound, then we can call the public methods within the service. But if it's not bound, we don't want to even try to call those methods because we'll get a runtime error. So usually we keep a Boolean property that declares whether the service is bound or not bound at a specific point of time. So to kind of summarize a bound service, in the client process we create a normal intent. You know, the class we're calling from, which is usually .this, and the class we're going to, which is something.class, and then we call bind service on the intent rather than start service. At some point later, we must call unbind service through the service connection object, and this usually happens in onPause or onStop. Then, once we have a bound service, and if it's bound, we can call the public methods of the bound service from the client object. Now, a bound service is kind of cool because it can sit out there and anything we want to, activities or other services, can bind to that service. The service will provide only one binder, but any activity we want to bind to that service and use those methods may do so. So bound services are the same class of services. They're just called with the bind service method from the activity instead of the start service method. But we set up the intents as usual. We can put extras to bound services or start services. Bound services, though, the extras usually perform setup, and that's really all they do. To stop a bound service, we make a call to stop service. And this happens through that service connection object. So the service connection object really just manages that bound service. All right, so there's 3 demos, one for a normal service, one for an intent service, and one for a bound service. You should look at those 3 demos and see how they work, and then use these in your own code. Thank you.